5:36 p.m., Monaco's legendary marina. White yachts lined up like pearls under the Mediterranean sun. A lavish launch party for a new super yacht is in full swing. Guests in silk and linen sip vintage champagne. At the edge of the pier, a man with grease-stained hands is tightening a mooring line on a service boat. As he steps onto the main deck to check a heavy cleat, a wealthy guest sneers. "Stay on deck, mechanic. This isn't the engine room." Laughter follows. The man nods quietly and turns back to the ropes. 2 minutes later, the billionaire owner walks out. He stops. He stands at attention. He salutes. Liam Carter was a man of rust, oil, and absolute reliability. At 43, his face was a living map of mechanical failures he had solved, etched with fine lines from years of squinting at sunlight reflected off the water, and hands perpetually stained by the dark, stubborn ink of heavy marine engines. He was a senior maintenance technician at one of the world's most expensive marinas, but to the owners of the floating palaces he serviced, he was largely invisible. Liam didn't own a yacht. He didn't even own a car made in this decade. He was the man who ensured that the billion-dollar dreams of others stayed afloat, literally. Liam's life had been distilled into two primary modes: fixing engines and being a father. 5 years ago, his world had been decimated when his wife, Sarah, passed away after a grueling 2-year battle with illness. He had traded his high seas career for this coastal town, taking a steady local job that allowed him to be home every night for his 10-year-old daughter, Maya. Maya was a bright, observant girl who had spent a significant portion of her childhood in the technical break room of the marina. While other children her age were playing with dolls or tablets, Maya learned the difference between a manifold and a gasket. She would sit on a crate of spare parts, her school books open on a workbench, breathing in the scent of WD-40 and sea salt while her father worked nearby. To her, the rhythmic clinking of his wrenches was the sound of safety. The work was grueling. Liam's shift often started long before the sun touched the horizon, when the docks were cold and shrouded in mist, and ended long after the luxury restaurants on the shore had opened their doors. He was the fixer, the man called when a winch jammed, a cooling system failed, or an emergency mooring was required during a sudden Mediterranean squall. He lived in the deep background of Monaco's glamour, a ghost in grease-stained blue coveralls moving through a sea of white linen. On this particular evening, the marina was a hive of frantic activity. The Moretti 5E was making its debut, a vessel so technologically advanced it required a specialized docking protocol. It was a masterpiece of carbon fiber and Italian engineering, painted in a unique shade of Moretti blue that seemed to shimmer even as the sun began to dip. Liam had been called to the primary pier because the sea breeze was sharpening, pulling harder against the hull than the morning's forecast had predicted. The pressure on the mooring cleats was reaching the red zone. He had spent the last 3 hours in the humid, cramped engine room of a service tug, his hands deep in a malfunctioning fuel pump that had threatened to stall the harbor traffic. When he received the urgent radio call to check the tension on the Moretti V's forward mooring lines, he didn't have time to wash up. He didn't have time to check his reflection. He simply wiped his palms on a dark rag, grabbed his heavy adjustable wrench, and headed toward the celebration. As he walked onto the pristine white pier, the smell of industrial lubricant and diesel fuel followed him like a shadow, clashing sharply with the expensive jasmine and sea salt perfumes of the gathering elite. He felt the weight of Maya's gaze. She was sitting on a nearby stone bench, her legs swinging, finishing her math homework while watching her father navigate the crowd of people who didn't even see him. To them, he was a stain on a perfect landscape, a smudge on the glossy photo of wealth. But to Maya, he was the giant who held the entire harbor together with his bare hands. Liam approached the yacht's boarding ramp, his eyes fixed on the heavy nylon lines. The music was loud, a sophisticated blend of modern jazz and the constant, rhythmic clinking of crystal. He needed to step onto the aft deck to inspect the secondary anchor lock, a critical point that could snap if the yacht surged. He wasn't there to network or taste the hors d'oeuvres. He was there to ensure the wind didn't turn this party into a multi-million-dollar collision. But as he crossed the threshold of the teak deck, the world of haves and have-nots collided in a single, mocking sentence that stopped him cold. The boarding area was crowded with guests waiting for the sunset toast. Liam tried to move quickly and inconspicuously, keeping his head down, focused on the heavy steel cleat near the polished railing. But his presence was too jarring, too real for this artificial paradise. A man in a $5,000 linen suit, holding a glass of vintage champagne that cost more than Liam's monthly rent, stepped directly into his path. This was Mr. Sterling, a frequent guest at the marina, known more for his inherited ego than any actual accomplishments. He looked at Liam's coveralls, then down at the faint black oil smudges on the white deck near Liam's boots. His lip curled in a mixture of amusement and disgust. "Check the uniform, buddy," Sterling said, his voice projecting over the music so his friends could hear. "You must be lost. Stay on the deck, mechanic. This isn't the engine room, and you're leaking on the carpet. Go find a mop before you ruin the upholstery." A few surrounding guests paused, then let out shallow, practiced laughs. They looked at Liam as if he were an uninvited insect that had accidentally flown into a gallery. Liam didn't snap back. He didn't explain the physics of the shifting current or the urgency of the wind gusts. He had learned long ago that people who shout for attention usually have nothing of substance to say. He looked at the cleat. The metal was groaning under the strain. "Just checking the line tension, sir," Liam replied quietly, his voice a steady, low-frequency rumble that didn't betray a hint of anger. "The wind is shifting northeast and gusting at 30 knots. If these lines don't have the proper lead, the hull is going to kiss the stone of the pier, and a carbon fiber hull doesn't take kindly to stone." Sterling rolled his eyes, turning back to his circle of friends with a dismissive wave. "Whatever you say, Chief. Just do your little inspection from the ground. We have a standard to maintain up here, and you're lowering the property value." Liam simply nodded, a tight expression on his face, and stepped back down to the concrete pier. He knelt on the hard surface, his knees protesting from a day of climbing ladders, and began to adjust the primary mooring winch. He didn't feel the sting of the insult. He was used to being the invisible help. But he felt a deep, cold sting, knowing that the safety of every person on that boat was currently dependent on the man they were laughing at. Maya had seen the whole thing from her bench. She stood up, her small school bag clutched in her hand, and walked over to stand beside her father. She looked at the guests on the deck, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a developing, sharp-edged protective instinct. "Dad, why do they laugh?" she asked, her voice hushed but piercing. "You're the one helping them. They're just standing there." Liam didn't look up from the heavy nylon rope, his fingers working the knot with a surgeon's precision. "Sometimes people only see the surface, Maya," he said, his breath hitching as he pulled the line taut. "They see the oil on my hands, but they don't see the engine that keeps them warm. They see the teak deck, but they don't see the anchor that keeps them from drifting. It's okay. The boat doesn't care what they think, and neither do I. We have a job to do." Maya frowned, looking up at the towering white hull that blocked out the sky. "They should care," she whispered to herself. Liam continued his work in silence. While the partygoers toasted to vision and growth, Liam was performing the actual grueling labor of sustainability. He noticed a 0.5% shift in the angle of the forward line, a tiny microscopic change that indicated the current was beginning to pull the yacht's bow away from the rubber fenders. If the wind hit 50 knots as predicted, the yacht's nose would strike the stone wall of the pier like a hammer. He worked in the shadows of the luxury. He adjusted the hydraulic pressure on the shore power lines. He checked the emergency release valves. He was a master of a world that the people sipping champagne above him refused to acknowledge existed. The silence of the dock was a stark contrast to the noise of the deck. But Liam was listening to a different kind of music. The groaning of the steel, the sharp snap of the ropes settling, and the rhythmic, ancient lap of the water against the pilings. He knew that the sea was an honest judge. It didn't care about designer suits or the year of a vintage wine. It only cared about the quality of the knots and the integrity of the steel. As he finished the primary adjustment, the heavy glass doors of the main cabin opened. A man walked out, not a guest, but the man everyone was there to see. Victor Moretti. At 58, Moretti was a billionaire several laying over, but his posture was that of a man who had spent his life on a bridge, not in a boardroom. He had the eyes of a predator and the weather-beaten skin of someone who had survived 1,000 storms. Victor scanned the deck, his expression neutral and unreadable. Then his eyes drifted down to the pier. He saw a man in blue coveralls kneeling on the concrete, adjusting a massive winch. He saw the grease on the man's hands, and he saw something that no one else in Monaco would have recognized. A specific way the man held his shoulders, a professional stance that spoke of a different life. The air on the dock seemed to chill. Victor Moretti didn't walk toward the open bar or the group of waiting investors. He walked straight toward the railing, his eyes fixed on Liam. The guests, including Mr. Sterling, stepped back, assuming the billionaire was about to unleash his legendary temper on the dirty mechanic who had dared to smudge his deck. Sterling even cleared his throat, ready to offer "I told him to leave, Victor," to gain a bit of favor. The deck of the Moretti Mayflower fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. The music seemed to fade into the background as Victor Moretti leaned over the railing. Mr. Sterling stood nearby, a smug, expectant grin forming on his face. He was leaning in, ready to witness the public execution of a peasant's dignity. "Mr. Moretti," Sterling chirped, trying to align himself with the power of the moment. "I tried to tell the help to stay on the deck below, but he's been hovering around your lines all evening. I apologize for the eyesore. I'll have security remove him immediately." Victor Moretti didn't even blink. He didn't look at Sterling. He didn't look at the champagne. He stared directly at the man on the pier, his eyes narrowing as if he were looking through a long-range telescope. "Liam?" Victor's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of absolute authority. It wasn't the voice of a CEO, it was the voice of a commander. Liam stopped. He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his coveralls, a look of genuine shock crossing his tired face. He looked up at the billionaire, and for a moment, the marina in Monaco vanished. They were somewhere else, somewhere colder and much more dangerous. "Commander Moretti," Liam said, his voice level and clear, cutting through the silence of the pier. Victor Moretti didn't say a word for a long, agonizing heartbeat. He stood perfectly straight. Then, to the absolute horror and confusion of every socialite on the deck, he brought his right hand to his brow in a sharp, crisp, and flawlessly executed military salute. The entire deck, the models, the venture capitalists, the politicians, froze. It was a sight that defied the logic of the Mediterranean elite, a billionaire saluting a mechanic. "Chief Carter," Victor said, his voice ringing with a professional reverence that made the guest's skin crawl with sudden, burning embarrassment. "The harbor master told me you were working this coast. I didn't believe him. I thought you were still running the fleet maintenance in the Pacific." Liam returned the salute with a precision that hadn't faded one bit in 15 years. "I'm a civilian now, sir, just keeping things running on the ground level." Victor Moretti didn't wait for the ramp to be cleared. He stepped off the yacht and walked down to the pier. He didn't care about the oil on Liam's sleeves or the salt spray. He reached out and gripped Liam's hand with a strength that suggested a deep, unbreakable history. "Civilian or not," Victor said, turning his head to address the stunned, silent crowd on the deck. "Half the ships I commanded in the Navy stayed afloat because of this man. In the middle of a Category 4 storm in the Bering Sea, when our primary engines died and the crew was ready to prepare for the lifeboats, Chief Carter crawled into a flooding engine room. He held the fuel lines together with his bare hands for 4 hours in freezing water just so we could maintain steering. He didn't ask for a medal. He asked for a fresh pot of coffee." Victor looked directly at Mr. Sterling, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of steel that made the man stumble backward. "I don't care what suit you're wearing, Sterling. In a real storm, you're just dead weight. But this man is the anchor. If he touches my boat, it's because he's the only person in this entire country I trust to keep it from sinking." The silence on the deck was deafening now. Mr. Sterling looked down at his glass, his face turning a sickly, dark shade of red. He tried to shrink into the shadows of the lounge, but there was nowhere to hide from the truth. Suddenly, a massive, unexpected gust of wind roared through the marina. The Moretti 5 shifted violently, the heavy rubber fenders groaning as the 100-ton vessel surged toward the stone pier. The guest cried out, stumbling as the deck tilted. The professional crew on board was caught off guard, fumbling with the remote winches. Liam didn't wait for an order. He reacted before the yacht's captain could even reach the bridge. "Moretti, get them to the center of the deck!" Liam shouted, his voice no longer the quiet rumble of a dad, but the booming, unmistakable command of a chief petty officer. "The wind is gusting to 60 knots. We're about to have a surge. I need the forward spring line tightened now." Victor Moretti didn't hesitate for a microsecond. He turned to his professional crew who were panicking. "You heard the chief. Do exactly what he says. Drop the secondary fenders. Now." For the next 10 minutes, the marina was a battlefield of wind and water. Liam was everywhere. He was on the pier, leaping across gaps to secure emergency lines. He was on the deck, directing the crew with hand signals that cut through the roar of the gale. He moved with a speed and confidence that made the billionaire's guests look like porcelain dolls. Maya stood back, her eyes wide with a new kind of pride she had never felt before. She watched her father take command of a multi-million-dollar crisis without a single piece of silk on his back. She saw the billionaire, the man the entire world feared, following her father's lead without question. When the yacht was finally secured, sitting safely 6 inches from the stone wall despite the howling wind, the surge began to die down. The crew was exhausted, breathing hard. Liam stood on the pier, his coveralls now soaked with sea spray, his hands raw and red from the heavy ropes. Victor Moretti walked back down the ramp, his own expensive shirt ruined by the rain. He looked at the boat, then at Liam. He let out a short bark of a laugh. "Same old chief," Victor smiled. "You still see the storm before the radar does." "I just listened to the lines, sir," Liam replied, his heart rate finally beginning to slow. Victor Moretti looked at the crowd on the deck, who were now staring at Liam with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "Go back to your drinks," Victor told them, his voice icy and low. "And remember the man who just saved your evening. Without him, you'd be swimming in your designer suits right now. And I wouldn't have bothered to fish you out." After the yacht was stabilized and the guests had retreated into the safety of the interior bar, Victor Moretti invited Liam and Maya into the private owner's cabin. It was a room of dark mahogany and deep leather, filled with maps, naval history, and the quiet hum of a perfectly tuned engine. "I heard you left the Navy right after the North Atlantic Commendation," Victor said, pouring Liam a glass of water. He looked at Maya and smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes for the first time. "Is this the reason?" Liam nodded, ruffling Maya's hair. "My wife, Sarah, she got very sick, Victor. The Navy was my life, but she was my heart. I couldn't be on a carrier in the Mediterranean while she was fighting alone in a hospital bed in a town she barely knew. I left to be there for her, and after she passed, well, Maya needed a dad who stayed in one place, a dad who wasn't a voice on a satellite phone." Victor sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You were the best tech lead I ever had, Liam. The Pentagon wanted you in a desk job in D.C. They were furious when you resigned. They thought you were wasting your talent. A desk in D.C. wouldn't have let me pick Maya up from school every day," Liam said simply. "I fix boats at the dock. It's not glorious, and the pay doesn't compare to a commander's pension, but it's a life. We're okay. We have what we need." Victor looked around his luxurious cabin, then at Liam's stained uniform. "We're not okay, Liam. This marina doesn't deserve you. I watched those people out there tonight. They look at your hands and they think they're better than you because they've never had to bleed for a machine. They don't realize those hands are the only reason they're safe." Victor reached for his phone and called the Marina Management Board on his private line right there in front of Liam. He didn't ask for a favor. He made a demand that sounded like an ultimatum. "This is Victor Moretti. I'm doubling my docking fees for the next 5 years, on one condition. Liam Carter is to be appointed as the Director of Marine Integrity for this entire facility effective tomorrow morning. He has full authority over safety protocols and technical maintenance. And if I ever hear a single word of disrespect from your staff or your guests toward him again, I'm taking my entire fleet to the Italian coast." Liam tried to protest, his face flushing. "Victor, I'm just a mechanic. I don't need a title or a board seat. I just want to work." Victor held up a hand, silencing him. "You're not just a mechanic. You're a leader who chose to be a father. That's the highest promotion in my book. And frankly, this place is a safety disaster waiting to happen. You're the only one who can fix the foundation. You owe it to the crews, Liam, not to the owners." He looked at Maya, who was staring at a large navigational map on the wall. "And what about you, young lady? Do you like these big boats? Or are they too noisy?" Maya looked at the billionaire, then back at the map. "I like when my dad fixes them, because when they're fixed, the people can go home, and my dad can come home too." Victor laughed, a genuine, warm sound that filled the cabin. "You've got his spirit, Maya. Make sure he takes this job. He's too humble for his own good." The meeting didn't end with a massive check or a flamboyant gift. It ended with a firm handshake between two men who understood that real power isn't about what you own, but about what you protect. Victor Moretti didn't save Liam Carter. He simply ensured that the world finally saw the man Liam had always been. As Liam and Maya walked back toward their modest apartment that night, the lights of the Monaco marina were reflecting in the dark water. For the first time in 5 years, the weight on Liam's shoulders felt a little lighter. He realized that Maya hadn't just seen him get insulted today. She had seen him get recognized by a giant. "Dad?" Maya asked, holding his hand tightly. "Yeah, pal. I'm glad the rich man saluted you. It looked cool, but I would have saluted you even if he didn't. I salute you every time you fix the toaster." Liam smiled, a lump forming in his throat as he pulled her close. "That's the only salute that matters in the world, Maya." 3 months later, the Monaco Marina was under a new regime. The signs that used to say authorized personnel only had been replaced by a new policy of technical transparency. Liam Carter was no longer hidden in the shadows of the engine rooms or the mud of the low-tide pilings. He was the director of marine integrity. He still wore coveralls, cleaner ones usually, and his hands were still often stained with oil, but there was a new, steady rhythm to the facility. The board meetings were fundamentally different now. When Liam spoke, the room went silent. Not because he was a billionaire, but because he was the only person in the room who actually knew how the pier was built and where the vulnerabilities were. He had implemented a ground-up training program for junior technicians, ensuring that the men and women in Greece were treated with the same respect as the captains in white. One afternoon, a familiar yacht rolled into the harbor. The Moretti V. Victor Moretti stepped off the deck, looking around at the vastly improved docking systems and the high morale of the ground staff. He found Liam at the end of the pier, teaching a young apprentice how to properly splice a high-tensile mooring line to prevent fraying. "How's the view from the top, Director?" Victor asked with a wink, leaning against a bollard. Liam looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He looked at Maya, who was sitting at a nearby table with a group of other harbor children, showing them a detailed diagram of a turbine engine. "It's the same view, Victor," Liam replied with a genuine, relaxed smile. "But the air feels a little cleaner, and the knots are holding." That evening, as the sun began its slow, golden descent into the Mediterranean, Liam and Maya sat together on the very edge of the pier. There was no party tonight, no champagne, no silk dresses, just a couple of simple ham sandwiches and the peaceful sound of the water lapping against the stone. Maya looked out at the rows of multi-million-dollar luxury yachts, then back at her father's face. "Are you enjoying the view tonight, Dad?" Liam thought about the Navy days, the storms in the Bering Sea, and the nights he spent in this very marina, worrying about how to pay for Maya's school supplies. He thought about the salute on the deck and the respect he had finally earned. Then he looked at his daughter, the most important vessel he had ever kept afloat through the storms of life. "I am, Maya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am, because this time, the view finally includes you, and we're not going anywhere." The story of the dirty-handed father and the billionaire ended not with a merger or a lottery win, but with a simple, profound realization. True respect isn't a destination you arrive at by buying a faster boat or a bigger house. It's a foundation you build day by day, knot by knot, through integrity, sacrifice, and the quiet courage to stay on the deck when the wind starts to howl and everyone else is looking for an exit. The harbor lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder that while the world looks at the glitter, the real work, The real honor is always happening just below the surface, in the hands of those who aren't afraid to get dirty. If you believe that real respect isn't bought, it's earned quietly through years of integrity, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where someone finally saw your true value?